Imagine you are standing in the middle of a city that is slowly dying. The streets are quiet in the wrong way, not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of exhaustion. The year is 1429. The city of Orléans has been under siege for more than 6 months. Its walls are still standing, but barely. Food is running low. The soldiers defending those walls are outnumbered and demoralized. The English forces surrounding the city have built a ring of fortresses so tight that resupply has become nearly impossible. And beyond Orléans, the rest of France is not much better off. For nearly a century, France has been bleeding. A war that no one alive can remember starting has consumed 2, 3, 4 generations of soldiers, farmers and kings. The English crown claims the French throne. French nobles fight each other as much as they fight the English. The Black Death has already swept through once, reducing the population by a third. And now, at this particular moment in the spring of 1429, the Kingdom of France is facing something that looks very much like its final hour. The heir to the French throne, a young man named Charles, has not even been crowned. He controls only a sliver of southern France. The north belongs to England and its Burgundian allies. Paris belongs to the enemy. Reims, the sacred city where French kings are traditionally crowned, is deep in English-controlled territory. Charles is not yet a king. He is barely a claimant. Some people openly question whether he is even the legitimate son of his father. This is the moment. This is the crisis. And into this crisis walks a 17-year-old girl from a village in eastern France who has never held a sword in her life, who cannot read or write, and who says that God has sent her to save France. Her name is Jehanne. We know her as Joan of Arc. What happens next is one of the most extraordinary stories in all of human history. Not because it is miraculous, whether you believe in miracles is your own business, but because it is true. The documented, verified, historically confirmed sequence of events that follows is strange enough on its own terms. A teenage girl walks into the court of a desperate prince. Within weeks, she is leading an army. Within months, she has broken the siege of Orléans, won a series of battles in rapid succession, and escorted Charles to Reims to be crowned King of France. Within 2 years, she is captured, tried, and burned at the stake. And within 25 years of her death, France has won the 100 Years' War. How? Why? And what does it actually mean? To answer those questions, we need to go back. Not just to the beginning of Joan's story, but to the beginning of the war itself, because you cannot understand what Joan accomplished without understanding the depth of the hole France was in when she arrived. The conflict we call the 100 Years' War did not start with a declaration of war. It started with a legal dispute. When the French King Charles IV died in 1328 without a male heir, the question of succession became genuinely complicated. The nearest male relative through the direct male line was actually Edward III of England, whose mother was a French princess. But French nobles were deeply uncomfortable with the idea of an English king ruling France, and they invoked an old legal principle, later called the Salic law, that barred inheritance through the female line. Instead, they crowned Philip VI, a cousin of the dead king, through the male line. Edward III initially accepted this, but when a dispute over territory in southwestern France escalated into open conflict, Edward revived his claim to the French throne as a political weapon. In 1337, Philip VI declared that Edward's French territories were forfeit. Edward responded by declaring himself King of France. And just like that, a legal argument became a war. What followed over the next several decades was a catastrophe for France, specifically for the French military establishment. The English, fighting with longbowmen and disciplined infantry tactics, inflicted a series of devastating defeats on the French cavalry heavy army. At Crécy in 1346, an English force significantly outnumbered by the French killed thousands of French knights with arrow fire. 10 years later, at Poitiers, the French king himself was captured. The ransom demanded was so enormous it nearly bankrupted the kingdom. Then came the Black Death, which hit France harder than England, killing somewhere between a third and half the population in some regions. Then came peasant uprisings. Then came decades of political instability, with French nobles forming factions, switching sides, and occasionally allying with the English against each other. By the time we reach the early 15th century, France is not just losing a war. France is fracturing. The most important fracture comes in 1407, when the Duke of Burgundy has the Duke of Orléans assassinated in the streets of Paris. This act of political murder splits the French nobility into 2 bitterly opposed factions, the Armagnacs, who support the Orléans family and the legitimate French crown, and the Burgundians, who support the Duke of Burgundy and are willing to ally with England to destroy their domestic enemies. In 1415, Henry V of England invades France and wins one of the most famous battles in medieval history at Agincourt, a victory so lopsided, against such overwhelming odds, that it seemed to confirm English military supremacy. Henry follows up this victory with a systematic conquest of Normandy. And in 1420, the Burgundians and the English together force the French crown to sign the Treaty of Troyes, one of the most humiliating documents in French history. Under the Treaty of Troyes, the French king Charles VI, who is mentally ill and barely functioning, disinherits his own son and declares Henry V of England his heir and the future king of France. Henry marries Charles's daughter. The deal is done. France has essentially surrendered its independence on paper, and then, with almost theatrical timing, both Henry V and Charles VI die within 2 months of each other in 1422. Henry V is 35 years old. His heir is an infant. The infant, Henry VI, is now technically king of both England and France, but an infant cannot rule, and France is not going to lie down quietly. Charles VI's disinherited son, the man we mentioned at the beginning, the uncrowned claimant, refuses to accept the treaty. He calls himself Charles VII, Dauphin of France, and establishes a court in the south. The Armagnac nobles rally around him, but the English and Burgundians control the north, control Paris, control Reims, and in 1428, the English begin the siege of Orléans, the last major city blocking their advance into the south. If Orléans falls, the war is almost certainly over. France, as an independent kingdom, will probably cease to exist. This is the world Joan of Arc is born into. She is born around 1412. The exact date is uncertain, in a village called Domremy in the Meuse Valley in northeastern France. The village sits on the border between French-controlled and Burgundian-controlled territory, which means Joan grows up in a place where the war is not an abstraction. It is a constant presence. Burgundian raiders occasionally sweep through the area. Refugees pass through. The village itself changes hands more than once. Joan grows up knowing, in a very immediate and personal way, what it means for France to be losing. Her family is not noble. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, is a farmer and a minor village official, a man of some local standing, but not wealthy, not powerful, not connected to the great world of courts and armies. Joan herself is described by those who knew her as pious, hard-working, and unusually serious for her age. She does not go to school. Almost no one in her village does. She learns to spin and sew. She tends livestock. She attends church. And then, when she is approximately 13 years old, she begins to hear voices. This is the part of Joan's story that every account must grapple with, and it is worth being careful here. What we know from Joan's own testimony under interrogation, which was recorded in meticulous detail, is that she heard voices she identified as belonging to Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. These voices, she said, told her that she had a divine mission, to drive the English out of France and to see the Dauphin Charles crowned as the rightful king. Whether these voices were supernatural, whether they were a form of religious experience that was genuine to Joan even if not literally miraculous, whether they reflected some form of neurological or psychological phenomenon, these are questions that historians and scholars have debated for centuries, and none of them can be definitively answered. What we can say with confidence is that Joan believed absolutely in what she heard. Her conviction was not performance, it was not manipulation. Everyone who encountered her, friends, enemies, skeptics, supporters, came away with the same impression. This young woman genuinely believed she had been called by God, and at some point, that conviction became impossible to contain. In 1428, Joan is approximately 16 years old. The siege of Orléans has just begun. The voices, she says, have become urgent. She approaches the local garrison commander, a man named Robert de Baudricourt, in the nearby town of Vaucouleurs, and tells him she needs an escort to take her to the Dauphin. She has a message from God. De Baudricourt, to his credit as a realist, tells her to go home. Her father should give her a slap in the face, he says. Joan goes home. But she comes back, and then she comes back again. Over the next several months, something strange happens. Word spreads about this girl and her claims. Some of the soldiers at Vaucouleurs begin to believe her, or at least to wonder. There is something about Joan that is difficult to dismiss. She speaks with absolute certainty. She makes specific predictions, including, reportedly, a prediction about a French military defeat near Orléans that is later confirmed. And in a world where religious faith is not a private matter, but the framework through which all of reality is understood, the idea that God might send a messenger is not inherently absurd. In February 1429, de Baudricourt gives in. He provides Joan with an escort of 6 men-at-arms and sends her on the 11-day journey to Chinon, where the Dauphin's court is located. The journey itself is remarkable. Joan travels in disguise, through enemy-controlled territory, in winter. She arrives at Chinon in early March 1429, and now comes one of the most famous scenes in the entire story. The Dauphin, Charles, is reportedly skeptical. He decides to test Joan. He disguises himself among his courtiers, putting someone else in his place on the throne. Joan walks into the room, a room full of hundreds of courtiers, none of whom she has ever met, and goes directly to Charles. Some accounts say she identified him immediately. Others suggest she was guided to him. The details vary depending on the source, and we should be honest about that uncertainty. But what is agreed upon is that Joan approached Charles, addressed him privately, and said something to him that convinced him she was genuine. What did she say? We do not know with certainty. Joan later referred to it as a sign she gave him. A secret, she said, that only God could have told her. Some historians have speculated she told him something about his private doubts regarding his own legitimacy. Charles, as we noted, was haunted by questions about whether he was truly his father's son. If Joan somehow addressed that specific anxiety, if she told him, in the name of God, that he was the rightful king, it would explain his reaction, because Charles's reaction is to take her seriously. Not immediately, and not without further scrutiny. He sends Joan to be examined by a panel of theologians at Poitiers, who question her for 3 weeks about her faith, her claims, and her character. They find no evidence of heresy or deception. They give a cautious endorsement. There is nothing against Christian faith in what she says, and given the desperate circumstances, it is worth trying. Charles gives Joan what she has asked for. He gives her an army. This requires a moment of pause because it is genuinely extraordinary. The military commanders of France, professional soldiers, experienced knights, men who have spent their lives at war, are now going to ride into battle under the nominal command of a 17-year-old girl from a farming village. How is this possible? Part of the answer is practical. Joan is not actually commanding in a technical military sense, at least not at first. She is a figurehead, a symbol, a morale device. The actual tactical decisions are made by experienced commanders like Jean de Dunois, the bastard son of the assassinated Duke of Orléans, who has been defending the city for months. But Joan's role is not nothing. Her presence changes something. And part of the answer is psychological and political. France in 1429 is not just losing militarily. It is losing the will to fight. The Dauphin's cause has been sustained for years by a combination of stubbornness and hope, but hope is running thin. Into this situation comes Joan, who offers something that no general can offer: certainty, not the cautious optimism of a military briefing, but absolute, unshakable conviction that God is on their side and they are going to win. For soldiers who believe in God, and in 1429, that is everyone. This is not a small thing. Joan arrives at Orléans on April 29th, 1429. She enters the city at night, through a gate on the side away from the main English positions. The citizens of Orléans come out to meet her by torchlight. Contemporary accounts describe the scene as electric, people reaching out to touch her horse, weeping, cheering. Whether or not they believed she was divinely sent, they understood what her arrival meant. The Dauphin had not abandoned them. Help had come. What follows over the next 9 days is one of the most compressed and dramatic military sequences of the entire 100 Years' War. The English besieging forces have built a series of fortified positions, called bastilles, around the city. These are not just camps, they are proper fortifications, designed to intercept any relief force and to maintain the stranglehold on the city. Taking them would require direct assault, which is costly and dangerous. The French commanders have been reluctant to attempt it. Joan is not reluctant. On May 1st, she sends a letter to the English commanders demanding they withdraw. The letter is dictated, she cannot write, and it is blunt to the point of provocation. Leave, it says, in the name of God, or face the consequences. The English response, according to contemporary accounts, is contemptuous. They shout insults back at her from the walls of their fortifications. On May 4th, French forces attack the English Bastille of Saint-Loup. Joan, who had apparently not been told about the planned attack and had been resting, reportedly rides out to join the fighting when she hears the noise. The Bastille falls. It is the first significant French offensive success at Orléans in months. On May 6th and 7th, French forces attack the fortifications on the south bank of the Loire, including the crucial position at Les Tourelles, the bridgehead that the English have held since the beginning of the siege. This is the most intense fighting of the entire operation. Joan is wounded during the assault. An arrow strikes her in the shoulder, between her neck and her armor. Contemporary accounts agree on this detail. She pulls out the arrow herself, or has it pulled out, weeps briefly from the pain, then returns to the fighting. This moment, the wounded girl returning to the battle, becomes immediately legendary. It is the kind of thing that soldiers remember and repeat. It transforms Joan from a symbol into a warrior in the eyes of the men fighting alongside her. Les Tourelles falls on May 7th. The English commander there, William Glasdale, dies when the drawbridge collapses under him and he drowns in the Loire. Joan reportedly wept for him, not because she was soft, but because he had refused to surrender and now his soul was in danger. Even in victory, she is thinking in the framework of her faith. The next morning, the English forces remaining around Orléans form up in battle array outside the city. They are offering the French a chance to fight in the open field. Joan and the French commanders ride out to face them. The two armies stand looking at each other across the field, and then the English withdraw. They march away. The siege of Orléans is over. It has lasted 8 months. It has ended in 9 days of French offensive action. The news spreads across France with extraordinary speed. Orléans is free. The girl from Domremy has done what she promised. The effect on French morale is difficult to overstate. After nearly a century of defeats and retreats and surrenders, France has won something, and it has won it under circumstances so unlikely, so dramatic, that the religious interpretation seems almost unavoidable even to people who might otherwise be skeptical. But Joan is not finished. She has a second objective, to get Charles crowned at Reims. This is a more complicated military problem than it might sound. Reims is deep in English and Burgundian territory. Getting there requires either fighting through or marching around hundreds of miles of hostile country. The conventional military wisdom says it is too risky. The Dauphin's advisors urge caution. Joan urges speed. Move now, she argues, while the momentum is with them. Do not give the English time to consolidate. The voices have told her the window is short. The campaign that follows, known as the Loire campaign, is a masterpiece of momentum. Between June and July 1429, French forces under Joan's influence win a series of engagements in rapid succession. Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, Beaugency, and then the open field battle of Patay on June 18th. Patay deserves special attention because it is, in military terms, one of the most significant French victories of the entire war. The English forces, commanded by John Fastolfe and John Talbot, both experienced and respected commanders, are caught before they can form their defensive line. The English tactical advantage in the 100 Years' War had always relied on the longbow, deployed from prepared positions. At Patay, the French cavalry catches them in the open. The result is a rout. Talbot is captured. English casualties are severe. Fastolfe flees and is later accused of cowardice, though the accusation is probably unfair. The situation was simply untenable. Patay reverses Agincourt, not in terms of scale, but in terms of meaning. For 14 years, since Agincourt, the English had seemed militarily invincible in the field. Patay proves they are not, and it proves it in a way that everyone in France can understand. The English can be beaten. With the Loire Valley secured, the road to Reims is open. Charles and his army begin the march north in late June. Town after town surrenders or opens its gates as they approach. Some of these towns have Burgundian garrisons. Some have English sympathizers. But the momentum of the campaign and the reputation of Joan makes resistance seem futile. Auxerre negotiates. Troyes, the city where the humiliating Treaty of 1420 was signed, surrenders after a brief standoff. On July 16, 1429, the French army enters Reims. The city, which has been under Burgundian control, opens its gates. And on July 17th, less than 3 months after Joan first arrived at Orléans, Charles VII is crowned King of France in the Cathedral of Reims. Joan stands at the ceremony with her banner. She had carried it throughout the campaign, and she later said she carried it at the coronation because it had shared in the labour and deserved to share in the honour. It is one of the most human and touching details in the entire story. After the ceremony, Joan reportedly kneels before Charles and weeps. She calls him gentle king and tells him that now God's will has been done. Those who were present described the scene as extraordinarily moving: the great cathedral, the newly crowned king, and this girl from a farming village who had made it all possible, weeping at his feet. It is the peak of Joan's story, and it is also in a sense the beginning of the end, because after Reims, things start to go wrong. The fundamental problem is political. Joan's mission, as she understood it, had two parts: relieve Orléans and crown Charles. Both are now accomplished, but the war is not over, and the political situation around Charles is complex in ways that Joan is not equipped to navigate. Charles's advisors, men like Georges de la Trémoille, who is essentially the power behind the throne, are not enthusiastic about continuing aggressive military operations. They are negotiating with the Burgundians. They want a truce, a diplomatic settlement. Joan wants to press the advantage. She wants to march on Paris. In August 1429, Joan and a portion of the French army do attempt an assault on Paris. It fails. Joan is wounded again, this time in the thigh, and crucially the assault is called off by royal order before it can be pressed to a conclusion. Charles negotiates a truce with Burgundy. Joan is furious, but there is nothing she can do. The truce with Burgundy holds through the winter of 1429 to 1430, and during this period Joan's military activity is reduced. She participates in some minor operations. She writes letters. She waits. The voices, she says, have become more ominous. They have told her she will be captured before the feast of St. John, which falls in late June. In the spring of 1430, the Burgundians break the truce and resume hostilities. Joan goes north to help defend the town of Compiègne, which is under Burgundian siege. On May 23, 1430, she leads a sortie out of the town gates. The sortie goes badly. The French forces are pushed back toward the town. The drawbridge is raised. Accounts differ on whether this was a mistake, a tactical decision, or something more sinister, and Joan, cut off outside the walls, is pulled from her horse by a Burgundian soldier and captured. She is 28 months past the moment she first arrived at Vaucouleurs. She is 18 or 19 years old. What happens next is one of the most disturbing episodes in the entire story, not because of physical brutality, but because of the calculated, systematic use of institutional power to destroy a person. Joan is sold by her Burgundian captors to the English. The price is 10,000 livres tournois, a king's ransom, literally. The English want her dead, but they want her dead in a specific way. A simple execution would make her a martyr. What they need is a trial that discredits her, that proves she was not sent by God, but was instead a heretic and a fraud. If they can achieve that, they undermine not just Joan, but the legitimacy of Charles's coronation and the entire French recovery. The trial is held at Rouen, in English-controlled Normandy, beginning in January 1431. The presiding judge is Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, a man who owes his career to English patronage and who has strong political reasons to deliver the verdict the English want. The prosecution is conducted by a team of trained theologians and canon lawyers. Joan has no legal counsel. She is alone, and yet the trial record, which survives in remarkable completeness, because it was transcribed in detail by notaries, reveals something extraordinary. Joan, who cannot read or write, who has had no legal training, who is being questioned by some of the most learned men in France, holds her own. The questions are relentless. They probe her visions, her theology, her obedience to the church, her choice to wear male clothing, her claims about the voices. The questioners are looking for contradictions, for heresy, for something they can use, and Joan, again and again, gives answers that are either theologically sound or carefully evasive. When asked whether she is in a state of grace, a question designed as a trap, because answering yes would be presumptuous and answering no would be an admission, she says, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." The notaries reportedly marveled at the answer. She is asked about her voices. She confirms them. She is asked whether her saints speak French. Why would they speak English, she reportedly says, when they are not on the English side? Even in this situation, even under this pressure, There is something in Joan that refuses to be entirely extinguished, but the outcome is never really in doubt. The trial is not a genuine inquiry. It is a procedure designed to reach a predetermined conclusion. After months of interrogation, Joan is presented with a document summarizing the charges against her and told to sign it or face death. The document she is shown may not be the one she actually signs. Later testimony from those present suggests the document was switched, that Joan was deceived about what she was agreeing to. She signs something, making a mark because she cannot write her name. The document she signs is a recantation, an admission that her voices were false, that she had sinned, that she submits to the church. In exchange, her death sentence is commuted to life imprisonment. But within days, Joan retracts the recantation. She resumes wearing male clothing, which she had promised not to do, and declares that her voices are real and that she was wrong to deny them. This act of relapse means she can now be handed to the secular authorities for execution. The church, technically, does not execute people, it just hands them over. On May 30, 1431, Joan of Arc is burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen. She is 19 years old. Contemporary accounts describe her death with a kind of awed horror. She asked for a cross to be held before her. She called on her saints. She called on Jesus. The English soldier who fashioned a small cross from 2 sticks and gave it to her reportedly said afterward that he feared for his soul, that he had helped burn a holy woman. The executioner, according to later testimony, said he feared he was damned. Joan's ashes are thrown into the Seine. The English are determined that there will be no relics, no tomb, no focal point for veneration. They have miscalculated, because the war continues. And the war, after 1431, begins to go very differently. The shift is not immediate. The English still control Paris. The Burgundian alliance still holds. But the political landscape is changing in ways that Joan's execution cannot stop. The most important change comes in 1435, at the Congress of Arras. After years of negotiation, the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, switches sides. He makes peace with Charles VII and abandons the English alliance. The reasons are complex. English arrogance, French diplomatic skill, the changing military situation, and perhaps the growing sense that the English cause in France is not going to prevail. Whatever the reasons, the Burgundian defection is decisive. It deprives England of its most important ally on French soil. Paris falls to the French in 1436 without significant fighting. The Parisians, who have lived under English occupation for nearly 2 decades, open the gates. The war continues in a reduced form for another 2 decades, as the English hold on to their remaining territories in Normandy and Gascony. But the momentum is irreversibly with France. Charles VII, with the resources of a reunifying kingdom behind him, modernizes his army, creating one of the first standing armies in European history, with professional soldiers paid by the crown rather than by feudal obligation. He develops a formidable artillery train. The English, fighting far from home, cannot match this. Normandy falls in 1450. Gascony, which had been under English control since the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine to Henry II in 1152, nearly 300 years earlier, falls in 1453 after the Battle of Castillon. There is no formal peace treaty. The English simply run out of territory to defend. The 100 Years' War ends not with a signature but with a silence. England retains only Calais, which it will hold until 1558. France is whole again. And now we need to ask the question that the story demands. What did Joan actually do? The easy answer is the military one. She broke the siege of Orléans. She won the Loire campaign. She got Charles crowned. These are real, documented, consequential military and political achievements. Without them, the French recovery might have taken much longer, or might not have happened at all. But the deeper answer is harder to quantify. Joan changed what was possible, not just militarily, but psychologically and symbolically. Consider where France was in early 1429. The war had been going on for nearly a century. The Treaty of Troyes had essentially formalized French defeat. The Dauphin's cause was geographically isolated and politically fragile. The English and Burgundians controlled the most important territories, the most important cities, the most important symbolic sites. There was no obvious reason to think this was going to change. Joan did not change it by military genius alone. though the speed and decisiveness of the Loire campaign reflects genuine strategic insight, whether it came from Joan herself or from the commanders working alongside her. She changed it by making people believe it could change. She changed it by making the Dauphin's cause feel inevitable rather than hopeless. She changed it by giving soldiers a reason to fight that went beyond pay or feudal obligation. A sense that God was watching, that the cause was just, that victory was not just possible but ordained. This is not nothing. In fact, in the context of medieval warfare and medieval politics, it may be everything. There is a military concept sometimes called the moral component of fighting power, the idea that will, cohesion, and belief are as important to military effectiveness as weapons and numbers. Joan understood this, whether or not she would have used those words. Her presence transformed the moral component of the French army at a moment when it was at its lowest point. And there is something else. Joan's story created a narrative about France, about French identity, French legitimacy, French destiny, that proved extraordinarily durable. She was not just a military leader. She was a symbol of the idea that France was a real thing worth fighting for, that the kingdom had a soul, that the cause of the French crown was not just a dynastic squabble, but something larger. This narrative would be invoked again and again in French history, in moments of crisis and transformation. During the French Revolution, when the old monarchy was swept away, Joan was briefly awkward. She had, after all, fought for a king, but she was quickly reinterpreted as a symbol of the French people, of popular resistance, of the nation rather than the crown. During the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71, when France was again defeated and humiliated, Joan became a central figure of national mourning and hope. During the German occupation in the Second World War, both the Vichy regime and the French resistance claimed her, which tells you something about how powerful and how ambiguous a symbol she had become. In 1920, nearly 5 centuries after her death, the Catholic Church canonized Joan of Arc as a saint. The trial that condemned her had been formally annulled in 1456, just 25 years after her execution, when her mother and her surviving brothers petitioned for a retrial. The retrial found that the original proceedings had been conducted in bad faith, that the charges were false, that Joan had been condemned unjustly. It was a remarkable act of institutional self-correction, even if it came too late to matter to Joan herself. The man most responsible for her condemnation, Pierre Cauchon, died in 1442, before the retrial, before the French victory, before any of it. History has not been kind to his memory, but let us return at the end to the girl herself, because it is easy, in the sweep of historical consequence and symbolic meaning, to lose sight of the actual human being. Joan of Arc was a teenager from a farming village who heard voices she believed were divine and acted on them with a completeness that most people never achieve in a lifetime. She walked into the court of a desperate prince and told him she was going to save his kingdom. She rode into battle in white armor. The white armor is documented, not legend, and was wounded and kept going. She stood before a hostile court of trained lawyers and theologians and answered their questions with a clarity and wit that the notaries could not help but record with something like admiration. She was afraid. The trial record shows this. She wept. She was lonely. She asked to hear Mass and was sometimes denied. She worried about her soul. She was a young woman in an impossible situation, and she knew it, and she did not break. Not really. The recantation, the signing of the document, this happened, but she retracted it. Whatever she had signed, whatever she had said in that moment of weakness and terror, she took it back. She said her voices were real. She died saying they were real. Whether you believe they were or not, whether you think Joan was a mystic, a visionary, a person of extraordinary psychological intensity, or something else entirely, the fact of her conviction is not in doubt. She believed. She acted on that belief at the cost of everything, and the world changed because of it. The 100 Years' War ended. France survived. The map of Europe that emerged from that survival, a strong, centralized French kingdom, shaped the next 5 centuries of Western history. The rivalry between France and England that defined so much of the early modern period, the French monarchy that built Versailles and fought Napoleon's wars and produced the Revolution, all of it traces back, in part, to a moment in 1429 when a teenage girl from Domremy walked into a room in Chinon and refused to be dismissed. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, one of the most remarkable things in the history of the world. There is a question that historians sometimes ask about Joan, and it is worth sitting with rather than answering too quickly. The question is, would France have survived without her? The honest answer is, we do not know. History does not come with counterfactuals. It is possible that the Burgundian alliance with England would have collapsed eventually regardless. The interests were never perfectly aligned. It is possible that Charles VII would have found other military leaders, other ways to rally his cause. It is possible that the English, stretched thin across the Channel, would have overextended themselves and collapsed in France without Joan's intervention. But it is also possible that Orléans would have fallen, that Charles would have retreated further south, or made peace on humiliating terms, or been overthrown. That England would have consolidated its hold on northern France, and the kingdom would have fragmented permanently. These were not impossible outcomes. They were, in the spring of 1429, the more likely outcomes. Joan made the unlikely happen. That is what the historical record shows. And the unlikely thing she made happen had consequences that rippled forward for centuries. She was 19 years old when she died. She had been a public figure for less than 2 years. In that time, she had done something that armies and kings and diplomats had failed to do for nearly a century. Her story has been told thousands of times in plays and novels and films and paintings and songs. Some of these tellings are accurate. Many are not. She has been made into a romantic heroine, a nationalist icon, a feminist symbol, a religious martyr, a military genius, a tragic victim. All of these framings capture something real. None of them captures everything. What the historical record gives us, if we read it carefully and honestly, is something more interesting than any of the simplified versions. A real person, in a real crisis, who did something extraordinary and paid for it with her life, and whose actions changed the course of history. That is enough. That is more than enough. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about what one person can do in a moment of historical crisis, then you already understand why history matters. Not as a collection of dates and names, but as the record of human beings making choices under impossible pressure, and those choices echoing forward through time. There is so much more to explore in this period. The 100 Years' War is one of the most consequential conflicts in European history, and Joan's story is just one thread in it. The rise of the French state, the transformation of English politics after the war, the Wars of the Roses that followed in England, all of it connects, all of it matters, all of it is worth understanding. If you want to keep going, subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. And if you have a question about Joan, about the war, about something in this video that you want to push back on or dig deeper into, leave it in the comments. The best history conversations happen when people bring their own questions to the table. Joan of Arc would probably appreciate the argument. But before you go, let us linger a little longer on something that does not get enough attention in most tellings of this story. The world that Joan left behind, and the specific ways in which her brief life reshaped the institutions, the politics, and the very idea of what France was. When Charles VII was crowned at Reims in July 1429, he was not simply receiving a ceremonial title. The coronation at Reims carried a weight that is difficult to fully appreciate from a modern perspective. It was not just tradition, it was legitimacy itself, made visible and sacred. The kings of France had been crowned at Reims since the baptism of Clovis, the first Christian king of the Franks, in the late 5th century. Nearly 1,000 years of symbolic continuity ran through that cathedral. To be crowned there was to be inserted into that chain, to become, in the eyes of God and the people, the true and rightful king. The English had known this. It is why they controlled Reims. It is why the Treaty of Troyes had been designed to make Henry VI the heir to France, so that when the time came, he too could be crowned at Reims and claim that same chain of legitimacy. By getting Charles crowned there first, Joan did not just win a battle. She closed a door. She made it impossible for any subsequent English king to claim the full symbolic weight of French kingship, because the anointing had already been done, and it had been done for Charles. This matters because medieval legitimacy was not merely a matter of military power. It was a matter of ritual, of divine sanction, of the visible performance of rightful authority. Joan understood this at some level, perhaps better than the professional diplomats and soldiers around her. She pushed for the coronation with an urgency that seemed almost irrational to some of her contemporaries. Why rush to Reims when there were still English armies in the field? Because she understood that the coronation was not a celebration of victory. It was a weapon. And it worked. After Reims, the political calculus across France shifted. Towns that had been wavering found it easier to declare for Charles. Nobles who had been hedging their bets had to make a choice. The Burgundians, who had built their entire political position on the argument that Charles was not the legitimate king, found that argument increasingly difficult to sustain in the face of the anointed, crowned, undeniable reality of Charles VII of France. Joan also left a more subtle legacy in the way she transformed the relationship between the French crown and the French people. Before Joan, the 100 Years' War had been, at its core, a dynastic dispute, a fight between royal houses over who had the better legal claim to a throne. The common people of France were participants in the suffering, but not really participants in the meaning of the conflict. Joan changed that. She was, herself, a common person. She was not noble. She was not educated. She was not connected to any of the great families whose rivalries had driven the war for a century. She was a farmer's daughter from a border village, and she had saved France. This fact was not lost on the people of France, and it was not lost on the chroniclers who recorded her story. Something new had entered the political imagination, the idea that France was not just the property of its kings and nobles, but something that belonged to the people who lived in it, something worth dying for, even if you were not a knight. This is not, to be clear, the same as modern nationalism. We should be careful not to project 20th century concepts back onto the 15th century. But it is the beginning of something, a thread that runs forward through French history, through the gradual strengthening of French royal authority, through the development of a distinctly French cultural identity, and eventually, centuries later, into the revolutionary idea that the nation itself is sovereign. Joan did not intend any of this. She was not a political theorist. She was a girl who believed God had told her to do something, and she did it. But history is full of people whose actions had consequences far beyond anything they could have imagined or intended. Joan of Arc belongs in that company, in the company of those rare individuals whose lives became, almost against their will, turning points in the story of civilization. There is one final detail worth preserving before we close. It comes from the retrial of 1456, the proceedings that formally rehabilitated Joan's name and annulled the verdict of 1431. Among the witnesses called to testify were people who had known Joan personally, childhood friends from Domremy, soldiers who had fought alongside her, courtiers who had been present at Chinon and Reims. Their testimonies, recorded and preserved, give us something precious, glimpses of Joan as she actually was, seen through the eyes of people who had known her in life. One of her childhood friends remembered her as someone who loved to dance and sing at the village festivals, who was quick to laugh, who was generous with the little she had. A soldier who had ridden with her remembered her directness, the way she spoke to commanders as equals, without deference, without apology. A courtier remembered her weeping at the coronation, and the way that weeping had moved everyone who saw it, because it was so obviously genuine. These details matter. They remind us that Joan of Arc was not a symbol before she was a person. She was a girl who danced at festivals and wept in cathedrals and pulled an arrow out of her own shoulder and stood alone before a court that wanted her dead and refused, in the end, to say that her voices were false. Whatever those voices were, that refusal was entirely her own. If you want to keep exploring this world, the wars, the kings, the turning points that made Europe what it became, subscribe and stay close. There is so much more to tell, and if Joan's story raised a question for you or challenged something you thought you knew, drop it in the comments. That conversation is exactly why this channel exists.